We are in the midst of disruptive innovation in education that I believe will radically improve the learning experience for students and the access to quality education globally. But while that is my belief, it is not necessarily the case, and that's the question that we'll be talking about on this panel. Is that really true? If so, why, and how do we make that happen? I'm Debra Dunn. I'm a member of the faculty at the D.school at Stanford, where I teach innovation, which we call design thinking, using a very interactive, team-based, multidisciplinary process. I'm also on the board at Skoll. And this topic, innovating in education, is one that has been of interest to me for many decades. In fact, I was amused last week when I was working on a presentation on something else to stumble onto an article that was written about my high school graduation speech. And I went to school in Florida, and it was in the local paper. And I was the valedictorian, so I got to give a speech. And the title of the article was Twin Lakes Valedictorian, a Sales Education System. So from a relatively young age, I have thought change needed to be made, and I'm very excited that it's afoot. And I am particularly excited to talk about this and these issues associated with the disruption of education with this very distinguished panel. So next to me is Stacy Brewer. Stacy is the CEO of a relatively new organization called eAdvance in South Africa. eAdvance has a mission of creating systemic change in the education system in South Africa. And in January, they launched Spark Schools, which are a network, ultimately, hopefully, a very large network of blended learning, low-fee private schools starting in Johannesburg. Next to Sandy is Sal Khan. Most of you have probably at least heard of Sal Khan because he's gotten quite a bit of buzz and visibility lately as the founder and executive director of Khan Academy, a nonprofit which provides free, very high quality education worldwide, both in online form and pairing that with teachers in the school system to disrupt education from a couple of directions. Sal also has a book out recently that I would commend to you called One World Schoolhouse, Education Reimagined. Next to Sal is Edith Harrell-Caperton. She's the founder and president of the Worldwide Workshop, an organization building visionary platforms for learning through game design and programming. And Edith is the author of Children Designers, Interdisciplinary Constructions for Learning and Knowing Mathematics in a Computer-Rich School. And finally, last but not least, Sandy Speicher, who leads IDEO's education practice, which takes a human-centered approach to creating positive impact in education, working with schools, with school systems, with foundations, with a variety of players. And I'm particularly excited about having Sandy on the panel because she brings a really deep human user-centered perspective to the challenges of transforming education and an end-to-end systems perspective to how you might go about doing that. So, Sal, I'd like to kick things off with you. While most people have probably heard about Khan Academy, they're probably not up to speed on what are you up to now? What kind of progress have you made? What are you working on? How are you thinking about this issue now?
Sure. Yeah, and the way most people perceive us is kind of this, oh, there's this video stuff. This guy used to be a hedge fund analyst, made videos for his cousins, and they liked him better on YouTube than in person, so he kept going. And the reality is around May of 2000, or around 2010, fall of 2010, when we got our first significant funding at the time from Google and the Gates Foundation. The goal was, yes, let's continue to, I continue to make videos. We started to look for other people who could make videos. But the real hope is that we could always turn this into a deep virtual learning platform. And in our minds, it was much more than just videos. Videos were going to be part of it, but it was about analytics. It was about ways for students to interact with each other and collaborate with each other. It's about practice problems, et cetera, et cetera. And so now, if we fast forward to today, we're a 40-person organization. Someone just accepted a job yesterday. That was 39.
All right. Congratulations.
Growing.
Growing. We're now reaching 6 million unique students a month. They're doing 3 million exercises every day. We could talk more about what these exercises are. They've done 1 billion to date. They've watched, I think, 250 million videos. The real focus of the organization, I guess there's a couple of directions right now. One is internationalization. I've actually spoken to a couple of y'all in the room about that. We've had a translation project of the videos for the last 2 years or so, and now we actually have 4,000 videos in English, and we now have 7,000 videos in other languages. And the goal is obviously to have 100,000 videos in other languages because we want the whole library. And part of that is also, it's redoing the videos. A lot of it is actually regional specific content, some that might be actual of economic consequence in the region. We are internationalizing the entire site so that it's not just the videos, the feedback, the analytics, all of that is available and the first wave is going to be Spanish and Portuguese, but shortly after Hindi and Mandarin and all the world's major languages. And the other thing that we've kind of changed how we perceive ourselves, and I think most people perceive us as a content site that happens to have a little bit of practice and assessment with it.
Right.
And what we realize is if we want to be serious about analytically thinking about the problem and measuring things and doing experiments that have real consequence, we have to view ourselves more as a diagnostic assessment platform site that happens to have content that could help you. And so a big focus that we're doing in the next 6 months along with the internationalization is, can we make these little practice problems that we have, and they're already pretty significant, can we turn them into really meaningful, rich diagnostics? And actually this whole movement to the Common Core, and especially in the US, is of help. But one thing I stress is that math is math. Our goal is to be a superset of all of the world's major curricula. And if we could do that, if on Khan Academy we have on-demand, state-of-the-art, adaptive diagnostics that's as good as anything out there, that an algebra teacher or a calculus teacher or a physics teacher says, wow, that's a better test than I could have written, we think a couple of powerful things could happen. One, it frees up teachers from grading and writing tests. These will be better tests because they have all the inputs, how long does a student take, et cetera, et cetera. It'll allow us to, one of the complaints we get is we have so much content on the site, people don't know where to start. So it'll give you a diagnostic. You know exactly where you start, and it can also be kind of an active tutor for you. And then the other element, and this might be the most exciting, is several people have, at this and at other events have asked us, well, how do you measure your impact? And it's total global learning due to us. And global learning due to us is total number of people learning times the average learning per user. And in order to do that second one, we have to really measure, are they really getting from knowledge state A to knowledge state B, measure it accurately? And then we can actually experiment. We can say, for user A, did this tutorial actually get them to there? Did it keep them engaged versus tutorial B? And so that's our focus, and we can talk about more stuff.
So one of the things I'm interested in your perspective on is, what was it about and it really was your early videos that kind of got this whole ball rolling in terms of the current wave of innovation? There's been lots of online education before, and there's been certainly lots of technology out there, but there was something very different, or something that captivated people in a very different way, and I'm sure you've thought about this a lot. What's your perspective on what is it about the way you started delivering education that had so much attractive energy for students and others?
Yeah, I don't know the exact answer, but we do think about it a lot because we don't want to lose whatever that might have been. And you're absolutely right. A lot of what we're talking about isn't a new idea at all. If you go back, when radio came out, this is going to revolutionize education. We'll put the best lecturers on the radio, and then it didn't happen. TV, VCR, so it's on demand now, and you could, and it never happened even when Internet 1.0. There was a huge push here, and actually there was some movement. Obviously, MIT OpenCourseWare, other universities moved in that direction. My guess of what happened, it was a blessing that I was literally just a guy trying to work with his cousins. I suspect that if in 2004, 2005, if Bill Gates had descended then and told me, hey, here's some money, make the best tutorials you can make, I probably would have fallen into the same trap that I think other people had fallen before. Oh wow, I gotta make what I think is the best, so I'm gonna hire a consortium of folks to write a script, then I'm going to go hire someone with a nice voice to read the script. I'll get some computer graphics people working on it, and the end result will, and you actually can see this from, even on YouTube, there are things like this where it's, nice computer graphics, and, the next step in photosynthesis is when the mitochondria, and it looks very polished, and for an administrator, they say, oh, that looks good. But for a student, they say, well, this sounds like my GPS device. This doesn't sound like something that I'm actually going to connect with at a human level. And I think, those early videos, even though I still cringe seeing some of them, they're messy, the handwriting's messy, I cough on the microphone, I answer the phone while I'm doing it. But people literally feel like there's just some guy, and he's trying to communicate his actual feelings and his thoughts, and he's transparent about it. He's down to earth. The form factor, these 10-minute long, you don't see my face. I think some of y'all will appreciate why now. and you focus purely on the content, and and they have that quirkiness that maybe you sometimes don't get from something that's more highly produced, and that's something we don't want to lose.
Great. Dee, let's hear a little bit more about what you're doing, which takes a somewhat different approach, though you are using technology to deliver education through the school system primarily. So tell us a little bit more about what you're doing at Worldwide Workshop.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. So I'm a social entrepreneur born and raised in a startup called Israel. And then I came to do my graduate studies in the United States. I spent a lot of time at the MIT Media Lab. I think these two learning environments shaped me. And I am obsessed in disrupting education with internet technology and computational tools as expressive media. And the Worldwide Workshop, as Debra introduced us, is an education innovation hub designing environments, platforms to empower youth and disadvantaged youth in underserved communities and orient them towards STEM and computing education. Globaloria is our flagship platform that has a learning management system, and it's like a MOOC for middle school and high school students, but it's blended because we highly emphasize the on-site and we blend it with the online in, I think, a very special way, again, to cultivate innovative STEM and computing thinking, design thinking, and getting students through Globaloria to design, prototype, program, learn how to code, work in teams on a network, and they code educational games or simulations or games for change. So they take a stance, they have to express opinions, they have to do public speaking as well as coding a real game. It's a very complex process. It takes sometimes 100, 150 hours. So they're practicing a big problem, solving a big problem. So we are raising problem solvers to pick on a theme that emerged in the talk today. So I wanted to focus on the proof. I spoke to Debra before this meeting. We have over 55 research reports and documentaries, and let's look at one.
When I really began all this, I was really lost because I've never done programming at all.
Alexander Aguilar aspires to become an automotive engineer someday, but his real passion for now is video games. For the past 5 months, he and fellow Santa Teresa High School senior Santino Santos have been learning how to plan, program, design, and produce a video game. 1,100 San Jose students are participating in a program called Globaloria, and this is their day to show off their work. The goal is to help foster interest in science, technology, engineering, and math at an early age.
The main principle in blended learning, I'm going to focus on maybe 6 or 7 really quickly, one a minute, that learning in a new way really deepens subject matter mastery. So it's not that they're learning how to code, they're learning how to design, prototype, engineer, code, work in teams, because it's a way to learn content. Whether it's mathematics, biology, many of our students love the Khan Academy tutorials. They use it as inspiration for their games, and sometimes they link to the tutorials from their games. So there is a very good complementary approach here that I want you to kind of think about.
My name is Angela Leaf. I'm a chemistry teacher at Greenbrier West High School, and I currently teach Global Area Chemistry 2. With the skeleton of how the curriculum works, being able to integrate it with the Chemistry 2 class, I think it helps a more diverse group of students. When I consider Global Area and integrating it in the classroom, what really excites me is the fact that I feel like in order to educate our students now and in the future, we have to be able to look at different ways of communicating with the students. I see this as the only model out there. We have so many students that are disconnected. I think this will really help gain those students back into the classroom.
So rural, poor population, very disconnected. And the idea is that you bring resources, both mentorship, professional development on a platform for the teachers, help desk, instructional help, expert on demand for the students, a lot of resources and tutorials for the students, but we customize and we pay close attention to the ecosystem where we are. We are connecting the students. We're gonna miss these videos, but I posted all of them on the WebEx social, on the Skoll social. All my links, all my videos are there. I posted them before coming here today. So because I'm gonna rush through this, I invite you to go to my profile and see everything there.
Most of these kids are pretty inexperienced. We have a low socioeconomic area here. A lot of these kids don't even have internet at home or a computer because they can't afford one.
Okay, so what's going to happen in the third level? Just out of curiosity.
It's so fun to watch them when they discover something that they haven't done before, such as they get a button working or they get something to move. That it's just, they're like, hey, come look, and they need to show me. They say, look what I got to work, because sometimes it takes them days before something will actually work for them. So it's really fun watching that when they actually get something to work, because they're so excited.
Yellow is your background here. You wouldn't even see it as you go through.
The skills that they learn are not just game design skills, but they're also blogging skills, wiki skills, videos, things that are very popular right now and don't seem to be going out of style.
So I'll just summarize this set of points, that we're teaching students how to think, how to explore, how to discover, how to design, and how to build. For me, the challenge is how to build blended learning that is scalable, that is doing that kind of learning, which is MIT-style education, and bring it to poor Latino communities in the United States, to any global community, and we are looking for global partners, so if any of you is interested in bringing it to their own countries, please let me know. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So, Stacy, your situation is really quite different. One of the reasons I'm really excited to have you on the panel is that you exemplify a trend that I hope we're going to see a lot more of. Stacy graduated not so long ago from business school in South Africa. You don't really have a lot of background in education, but she was really concerned about the state of education in South Africa, as she'll probably mention, and didn't see a lot of people tackling that problem. And so she traveled around the world to find some great models that could be implemented, and decided to take it on and start a new school using a blended learning model. So tell us a little bit more about what you're doing.
Okay, great. Thank you, Debra. So just to put it all into context, eAdvance, so I'm the co-founder and CEO of eAdvance, which is the management company that builds and supports a network of schools, and our first school being Spark Schools. Spark, the actual name, comes from a William Yeats quote saying, education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. And so we want to create that both in the child and in the country. So Spark Schools, we believe, are the first truly blended learning model in primary schools, elementary schools in Africa. And why we started it is because we saw that there was a massive problem in South Africa. We rated 140 out of 144 on the Global Competitiveness Report. That means we are beating Yemen, Libya, Burundi, and Haiti. You saw Rwanda, you've seen Senegal, they are beating us. And yet we've got a Nelson Mandela lecture theatre right next door. So why is this disparity going on? At the same time, that's on a macro scale. If you look on a micro scale, one of our education specialists says quite a controversial comment saying that our children will have a greater chance of success if they leave schools and they join gangs, which his argument is saying basically in gangs, at least you're part of a family, at least someone's looking after you, at least they're teaching you something that you can succeed. So there are a lot of problems in South Africa, and at the same time, we saw that there was this massive opportunity, the whole low-fee private school movement, whether it was a combination of the whole apartheid system as well as parents voting with their feet, losing faith in the current state schools, and choosing to pay for school fees. So we saw the problem and we saw the opportunity, but now we were looking for the solution to solve it. And unfortunately, in South Africa, there was no solution that we thought, because we were looking for high quality, sustainable, and scalable. And we looked further afield, we looked at models throughout Africa, we looked at models in India, and we didn't find anything that we thought was high quality, but at a very affordable cost. And every decision that we do at eAdvance and at Spark Schools was about, would we send our child to the school? And if we say no, then we've got a problem and we've got to change it. Just because we're targeting low-income, underserved communities doesn't mean that it's acceptable that we can provide them something substandard. Eventually, we found a model in the US that we're replicating, that we have replicated in South Africa out of San Jose, a blended learning model in terms of a lab rotation that we have found extremely effective, and it's already very disruptive. We are providing education at half the price of top government schools. In South Africa, you pay for education, healthcare, security, you pay for everything. And our kids are already doing work that are 2 years beyond their peers. So in order for us to create a systemic change, we feel it's extremely important to provide the best product. Steve Jobs didn't try to create something that was slightly better than what the current market was. He went for the top, he went for the best, and that's what we are trying to do, because that won't only change the stream of education, but it will put South Africa on the economic playing field. So that's a bigger vision, is really systemic change, but through a bottom-up approach as opposed to putting pressure on government, which everyone's doing. So by showcasing to the country, this is how you run things. Academically, financially, we hope we can create this ripple effect throughout the country.
Terrific, thank you.
Thanks.
So, Sandy, I'm interested in your view, having looked in developing countries, particularly, at this question of how do you, like Stacy's trying to do, build an end-to-end, highly excellent from an academic perspective, but also economically sustainable, scalable model. So tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing in this space and some of the things you've learned.
Sure. So I thought at a very high level I'd start by just introducing IDEO, and myself, by the way. Hi, I'm Sandy. I'm this clicker. I work at an organization called IDEO, which is a design and innovation firm. So we partner with people like you see here in order to create great solutions, and I lead our work in education. And so I'm very focused in this sector, everything from children all the way up through adults, and of course around the world. The core of the way that we approach our work is to start by asking what really matters to people. And this doesn't mean we say, what would you like for your education? It's actually saying, let's understand your life, the way that you live, the way that you work, the things that you care about, and say, how do we design solutions that match those desires? So that means that when we're working in questions of learning, we're actually looking at things like this, or like this, or even like this, my favorite image of all time, because I think, what other president would you say that to? Huh? But see, all of these ways that people are living today reflect the times, they reflect the values, they reflect how they engage in the world. And so we need to consider these things as we're designing solutions for them, and that is also true in education. So I threw in some highlights of the things that we've been working on. We take inspiration like that, and we think about it in terms of how we then can design, for instance, tools and technologies for learning. This is, ironically, actually, in education, particularly in these spaces where there are a lot of startups, they often don't want specifics shared. So I have to say, an integrated tablet solution where kids can have everything that they need in their backpack just in their tablet. So think about how the classroom can actually become in your hands at all times. We've taken that into global context, so taken our process and worked with organizations like Tada to design tools that will bring content into the classroom so that teachers can teach in new ways. We've been doing this for adult learners as well. This is an example of a platform that we've developed that is specific for corporate learning around higher order skills such as innovation. And this takes Clay Christensen's philosophy and turns it into a curriculum, but designed on a platform that integrates that's sort of designed around the way that adults are learning and working today, which has to be in kind of much more smaller doses and sort of competes with Game of Thrones. So we have to make sure that sort of the level of interaction sort of helps you make the choice toward learning. And this is being rolled out globally right now, actually, both in the US and in India. We also are working not just in the specific kind of products, but also in the ecosystem that's actually driving the creation of those products. So right now, it's sort of the Wild West in educational technology. There's a lot of opportunity. There are a lot of players running to it. And there's not necessarily a lot of clarity around what the needs exactly are. And so we're helping organizations like, this is the iZone in New York City, create briefs for developers about the kind of apps that could be developed that would help middle school math learning. We're also working with organizations like the Gates Foundation and Digital Promise to look at the challenges across the sector. There's so many startups that are not quite getting to market. There are so many schools with needs. What's going on in the middle? In case you're curious, we codename every project, and that one's called Pipe Cleaner, which I think is the perfect metaphor for some of these challenges, procurement, for instance, being a lot of the barriers. So we're looking at a lot of the system dynamics to help these things get set up. But the thing that Debra's pointing to is we've spent the past couple of years working with an organization in Peru around the similar question of how do we design whole school models that are affordable, scalable, and excellent. And so I'll probably be referencing this a lot more in the panel. But I thought just for a second I would share with you some of the things, some of the highlights we're learning as we look at questions of education, particularly technology, in a more human-centered way. So actually, Sal started saying this before, but a lot of sort of phase one of educational technology tends to be thought of as how do we get content to people, as if that's what learning is the transmission of the content. And so a lot of early ed tech products were about sort of just the inventorying of content or the transmission of it, so connecting people to content. But if you look from a learner-centered perspective, if you look at what people actually want, and I want you to think about this in your own experience, because kids are not really that different than adults. We're all human. We all thrive in connection with others. We all want to know where we are and where we're headed, right? You can think about this in any question that you have in your life. We want to feel actively engaged, and we want to feel in control of what we're doing. That doesn't mean we want to decide what it is, but we want to feel that we are in control and a part of it. And this is just kind of core human motivations. So then we have to think about how can ed tech help deepen social connectivity? How can we use it to connect people to people? How can we use it to help connect people to their own progress so they understand where they're going? And how do we help connect people to their possibilities? So this, I think, actually, the examples we have up here, actually, Idit and Sal, what Sal they're doing specifically is doing this really well, which is why these products are taking off. And just one more level to this is it's not just about thinking about the learner. As we want to integrate these tools into systems, we actually have to think about the many stakeholders. And I'm not going to go into every type of stakeholder that exists into this, but just thinking at a quick level about teachers. Nobody wants to be replaced. And when we think of educational technology as the transmission of information, what then becomes the value of the teacher? Now, her value has to increase, right? So how do we use technology to help her value increase? People are in their jobs because they want to apply their own creativity. Let's not take that away from them. And also school leaders, they need kind of proof that stuff is gonna happen, right? And so when we think about the integration of educational technology, let's think about tools that help deepen teachers' awareness of what's happening, which again, these tools do very well, that enhances teacher creativity, and also kind of provides a system-wide view so we can help all the stakeholders meet their needs. And so just to end here with a question, is as these technologies get more and more sophisticated, we're in this great moment where we can finally ask the question, how do we reimagine the way we're doing school? Because these things are still true. They have been true throughout history. We engage in the same way, but the tools we have available and the ways that we do it, the how we do it, there's major potential to have that elevate now. So that's where we're coming from.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So one of the questions that all of this raises for me is the question of the role of the school versus the student working independently through the internet to access a variety of things that are available. And you're all taking some different approaches, but I'm interested in your views on that as you look forward. You know, is it necessary that we have a blended learning model everywhere? Are we talking about transforming government schools? Can low-cost private schools be the solution? So I'd love for each of you to comment on that issue of how you see the role of the school and the transformation of the school as we look forward. Yeah. Who'd like to jump in? Edith?
Yeah, I would love to say something about that. I think, especially when I work in disadvantaged communities that are underserved both economically and technologically, the school has a major role to play for both rural and urban poor. And we have been creating that system that we just Sandy just described. In the sense that the school, first and foremost, need to create space for the students to do self-paced, self-directed, exploratory design learning. They need to make sure the teachers are really well trained in that new system and they can be supported. But the school also has a huge role in community development, so the community can then take the blended learning and spread and scale the impact from within the community. School can invite the parents, they can invite policymakers, the school boards. They can really become the hub for the community. School decided to do an open house event, which we call Globies, and they really are inviting parents who cannot even imagine their students doing this new kind of technology-infused blended learning. And the parents are just walking around and looking at students' projects. Students learn to do public speaking. They really fight for issues that are represented in their games. And the school leaders also feel very cool about becoming change leaders and attracting policymakers to kind of then allow them to have the budget and whatever else they need. So I really feel school has a huge role to play.
So let's go to you next, because you may share that view, and I could imagine you having a quite different view as well.
Sure.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. You know, I have young children, and I imagine them, or they will be going to a physical school very, very shortly. And what the school I want them to go to isn't one, frankly, that most of us went through, where, especially by first or second grade, it's, okay, sit in your chair, be quiet, fingers on your lips, stare at the chalkboard. And it's interesting because a lot of, and you quoted something, you know, about, you know, the spark of, I think, curiosity is or the spark of something, you know, that the purpose of education is to kind of ignite a spark of curiosity.
Right.
I'd go a step further, that the purpose of education is at minimum not to squelch the spark of curiosity. And I say that because I have not met a 4-year-old who you literally have to fight from exploring something, from looking into it. And these are the same kids that as soon as they get to first grade, they're reprimanded for that exact same behavior. They go through 12 years of that, and then they go get and then we're like, oh, we need more creative people. We're not finding any. We need but the reality is it's funny, some people would call it indoctrination, and I was on a panel that was Carlos Slim, and he said domestication. And I said, oh, maybe it's a language barrier thing. Maybe you mean indoctrination. No, domestication. And so the schools, I imagine, it's not about technology or not technology. It's about what is the ideal. And 400 years ago, before we had mass public education, people actually knew what the ideal was. It just didn't apply to more than a very small fraction of people.
Right.
It was personalized instruction, learn at your own pace, master concepts before you move on, have a lot of time for open-ended exploration, for hands-on work. When the Prussians, 200 years ago, and it was very egalitarian, said, well, we want to do mass education. We have this industrial revolution. How do we do it? Well, how do we do anything at mass scale with reasonable quality? We batch things into groups. We have them move together at a set pace. We try to apply some processes to them. At some point, we grade them. These oranges go to Whole Foods. These oranges get squeezed for orange juice. And you just, I don't know if that's a good analogy.
I got it.
Yeah, very good, very good. And we continued that. And then obviously the US, Great Britain, Japan, we actually borrowed that system when we also, and there's no coincidence that these were all the first nations that that had a broad middle class. But now our reality, before you needed a large labor class and a small creative class, now it's flipped around.
Right.
You need a very broad creative class and a very small labor class. And in that reality, we have to say, well, what's the ideal? Well, it's always what it was. It's self-paced instruction, personalized instruction, interactive. 30, 40 years ago, it just wasn't practical. It was too costly. What's exciting about, I think, what everyone here is talking about is it's actually now completely doable. By having students work at their own pace, I mean, we're being used right now in about 30,000 classrooms. Students are going at their own pace. They're mastering concepts before moving on. It frees the classroom to work on the type of stuff Edith is talking about and other projects. It frees us to actually rethink the entire classroom. If it's not about lecture anymore, why do you have to have one teacher in a room? Why not have two teachers with twice as many kids? Why not leverage the peers in the room? A good teacher at 30 was probably a pretty good teacher at 16. Why not leverage that resource and give them some leadership skills?
So if we agree, and we'll take two as agreement at this point, that we don't necessarily want the classroom to go away. We just want it to be radically transformed. And if our aspiration here is that everybody all around the globe in the most underserved areas gets access to this quality education that's now beginning to be provided in some places, what does that model look like? And I'd love for you, Sandy, and you, Stacy, to address that based on your experiences in less fortunate environments.
Yeah. I can talk about that a little bit in some work we've been doing in Peru. So this has been about designing a school model that is affordable, scalable, and excellent. And we had some great constraints to design for, which was international quality education, affordable price with a target of $100 a month for tuition. And it had to be scalable. So it couldn't just be designed for the conditions that were appropriate for 5 schools, but we had to think in terms of 70 or 200 because the conditions change. One of the things that happens as you start to think about the whole of the system is you have to think about the type of teacher that you're able to hire at that scale. And that some of these constraints actually then help you be incredibly creative about the way that you're thinking about the pedagogical model, right? So actually, Sal knows this well because we've been using Khan Academy in these schools in Peru, but we actually helped them design a blended learning model that integrates many different types of technology-based experiences. And it's not for technology's sake, it's actually because through these tools, students can develop different types of skills than they could in the regular classroom. They actually develop self-direction, they develop autonomy, they get to work at their own pace, they get to work in partnership. And they get to kind of have a accountability for their own learning that's very different than when a teacher is defining what should be happening. So the thing is, you can't immediately change the entirety of the model because teachers are trained in a certain way and parents have been acclimated in a certain way. So particularly in developing contexts, and we've been training for the emerging middle class in Peru, a lot of the parents were saying, it doesn't look like how I learned. So how they learned, someone stood in front of the class and read a script and they transcribed it. And they came home and their notebooks were full. And that looks like learning. But these kids come home and their notebooks are empty. And the parents are kind of frightened that learning isn't happening. And their mental model is how they had it, but they know they need it to be different. And so there's a lot of education you have to do to kind of, with everyone, you have to be able to show, here's how the learning is happening today. And you have to bring them in, you have to help them see it. I'll just put an anecdote in here, and this was actually, you probably know the statistics. We ran a pilot around this new blended learning model, and there were 2 things that were sort of fascinating to us as having conceptualized the experience than having tried it. First of all, we were frightened of what parents would think to bring technology into the classroom as one of the primary ways that students were learning. We also changed the teacher-student ratio when we did this. We had 1 teacher for 60 kids, which most parents think is the wrong way to go, right? We were expecting a fairly strained response for even a short trial period. And what we heard within a week was, do not take this away from my kid. We saw parents being incredibly inspired by the way that their kids were engaging and the way they were talking about their learning. That was a great confidence booster too. We can actually see in new ways. The other one was, actually there was an extreme assumption, in fact it had been researched, that the students that these schools were serving had no technology at home. We could not rely on outside of the classroom, which meant every kid had to be provided a laptop, but they couldn't really, or a computer, they couldn't really take them from school. Somehow in this pilot phase, 83% of kids logged in from outside of school. So these were two interesting learnings to me. In the developing context, is we're making, I think, a lot of assumptions about what people are ready for and what people are able to do. And I think that the key is actually kind of bringing them along in a way, right, so that they actually can help shape it and understand why the changes are happening, and then being in dialogue about how to make that work in a continued implementation.
Great. So what have been, Stacey, some of your experiences in actually doing this on the ground? And as you are looking at scaling in South Africa, how are you thinking about how scalable is the low-cost private model? Is that the way to go, or do you have to get the government on board?
So, yeah, to get the government, okay, so our vision is 64 schools in the next 10 years. And I know in terms of the developed world, it sounds extremely small. But compared to the South African standard, we've got 20 schools in 20 years. That is probably the biggest chain. So currently everyone thinks we're extremely aggressive, but we just want to create that stir. And by going blended learning, it decreases the cost to educate, which means we can scale. And that's what is very disruptive in developing markets. But you've got to be very careful about it, because if we went the radical route and we had 60 kids in a class, 2 teachers, you wouldn't have anyone sign up. We are not a tech-rich environment, so we've got to educate our population before you start getting radical. So we've started, obviously, at the primary school, the elementary school level, where it's a lab rotation. So the classroom and the lab are firewalled. All the teachers have to do is read data reports from the computer room. It's fundamentally a computer room, and that also helps inform instruction in the classroom. But if we straight away had computers or iPads or whatever the craze at the moment is in the classroom, it would not work, because we cannot expect our teachers, where we've got a capacity problem anyway, to be tech savvy, to be experts in teaching. So we say technology must rather play the role of optimizing teacher-child interaction in order to elevate their relationship. And especially for primary schools, technology can play the role of really cementing fundamentals. And that's the role of the learning lab in our system. But obviously, as the kids get older, you can start flipping the classroom. But we also need to create great people, not just extremely bright people. We are all social beings. So we're adamant about the holistic individual as well.
And do you think it's reasonable to assume that as you bring more and more schools online, and parents get more excited about their kids having a much greater learning experience, there will be sufficient pressure to get the government system to change?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way we've positioned ourselves is we're not against government. And I think you should never, ever be against government. Everyone is in one country. The private sector has got a significant role to play as well. So they're very open to what we're doing, and we say we will share best practices. So we've got an open door policy. Government, and a lot of government officials have already come in, and they say, we love what you're doing. You're providing education cheaper than what we can to some degree, and your results will be world class. So it's that constant relationship building. But in order to create that systemic change, taking over existing government schools, we need to showcase to the country before you enter negotiations. Otherwise, you've got one massive power and a small power where government needs to realize the role we can play, and that we've got a lot more value to add than, say, they do. So it's just always relationship building, but don't cut government out or think you can do it alone either.
So a very closely related question is on this topic of internationalization that several of you have mentioned. And so I'm interested in diving into that a little bit deeper to understand exactly what it means from your various vantage points, and how tough a nut is this to crack? Because I would bet that many of the folks in the audience from other countries are saying, it's all well and good that Khan Academy has all these videos and you're translating them, but they're really not going to work in my environment because people are not going to view them as appropriate. So that's but one thing people might be thinking. But I'd love to get a little more depth on where are we with internationalization? How hard was it for you to find content that you can use in your computer lab? Let's dive a little into that topic.
I can start. I can kick us off here. One of the things that we see as a challenge here is you can obviously design for one place built out of the needs you see in that place, and that may not instantly translate, not just language-wise, but sort of culturally or the sort of the social norms into another system. But there are actually very few distribution systems and even social networks to be having these conversations through. So even if there are great products that could actually help schools in other places, it's very difficult for people to learn and to know that they're even happening, much less than actually help their teachers understand even how to use them. So there aren't a lot of sort of aggregated networks where we can help sort of have these conversations through, which I think it makes it very difficult to be sort of learning together as we're making these things.
Can I add something to this? This is a great comment. You wanted us to go deeper. I'll go into theory for a second because I think in that sense we are all the same internationally. So everybody's name, all the speakers' name starts with an S. My name starts with an A, as somebody pointed out to me, with an I. So here's how I feel I'm different in blended learning, and I would like to be provocative to create this discussion on the internationalization. From my perspective, the theory goes that there are 4 modes of learning in blended learning, that the beauty of it is that they can now all be combined. I come from the theory that says you start with design. You start with thinking about a big question, and you pursue your content learning through building something, okay? Through working in a team, through building something. Then you're motivated to go to the expert, to the tutorials, to the resources online, to work with your peers, to co-learn with your teachers. And if our school leaders understand that, whether they are in Bangladesh, whether they're in India, whether they're in South Africa, in Brazil, or in Harlem, if they understand that, they buy Global.org. Okay? If they really buy into that methodology that this platform provides with all the dashboards, the learning management, all the data, the dynamic representations for students, for teachers to grade. We are teaching teachers how to grade design projects. We are teaching them how important it is to learn through design. If they buy into it, then that's the language that I'm talking about. How are we going to translate into the right accent or the right nuance in English or Spanish that we talked about yesterday? And how are we really going to make the language work? I feel right now it's important but secondary to the culture of learning that our blended learning platforms are affording.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Can I add, so to implement a blended learning model into South Africa is obviously very difficult, especially if we adapt in a model from the US. So we are lucky to have 2 of the experts from the organization in the US to come and work full-time with us. But the problem came is when we needed the content providers. So in terms, luckily eventually we secured ST Maths, but we tried other maths providers and they either weren't ready or weren't willing to come into developing markets. They didn't think we had the capacity. They don't think we've got the resources. So we really struggled. Eventually, one obviously did sign up, but the other vendors that we approached, they were not willing. At the same time, on the literacy side of things, we can't use American English. You guys spell differently. You've got different terminology, whatever the case is. So we need British English. And then to provide that content provider is also extremely difficult. Yet, because the American content providers are brilliant, because they gather data, all that type of thing to inform instruction. But then internationally, the literacy programs that we need for our blended learning are very limiting. And we're using the one from Australia at the moment, but it's not good enough. So we constantly looking what's happening. But I urge the developed world, please, to come into developing markets in order to share your best practices with us, because you will be meeting a great, great need, and especially in education and providing access.
Yeah, no, and I mean, just following up on what everyone else said, I mean, for us, it's really a big experiment. We don't know what's going to happen once we internationalize. And it's going to be very different from my sense market to market, or even within markets. I mean, even in the US, I mean, we talk about blended learning, and I talk about all the classrooms, but there's night and day differences with classrooms. And there's some models of classrooms that, frankly, when I learned what they were doing, I was like, I don't know if I would do it that way. That's a little bit, but for that circumstance, it seems to work, at least in the dimensions that were measured. Who knows if it's perfect, if it can't be optimized. And so there's probably, even in the US, 50 different ways that Khan Academy is being used in the classroom. I suspect once we internationalize, In some of the developing world, I don't think as soon as we translate into Bengali, I don't think, there's 300 or 400 million people in the world who speak Bengali. Few people realize that. It's actually the fourth largest. I'm a Bengali, so on average, we tend to be poorer than average, so people don't notice us as much. But I don't expect once we translate it to Bengali overnight we're going to get huge penetration into. We already have high penetration on our English content for the middle class, but it's not like all of a sudden people in rural areas who don't speak English are going to use it. They need access to it. They need internet. They need a million different things. What that will do is hopefully empower other NGOs who are local to that region. Like yours, to say, hey, I can, at least on a smaller scale, start showing implementation models that work. And if I can show small-scale implementation models that are at high quality, that are low cost, then the Minister of Education will hopefully take notice. On the other end, you do have the Koreas and the Japans of the world where you have higher broadband penetration, and you have a kind of a culture that's almost hungry for this type of thing. And so I think there we might even have, in fact, we almost definitely will have higher penetration than we have in the US. So it's a big experiment, and it's really partnering with other folks who are more local to figure out how it can work.
So recognizing that it's early going, I'm wondering about your early perceptions on the key aspects of internationalization, because I think a lot of people think immediately of language translation, but it seems that there are many other aspects that could be quite fundamental around the images that are used, the symbols that are used, the even learning styles that are presumed that could be quite different in different cultures.
Yeah,
learning theory.
I learned that beating a dead horse does not carry over well into other languages. They find it funny, though. We've actually experienced that. Once again, from our point of view, it's an experiment. So far, most of the feedback we have has gotten around the language things. We realize that most of Latin America, I hope I don't offend anyone, does not like Argentinian Spanish. They want Colombian Spanish. The Arab world wants Egyptian Spanish. The Arabic world. What did I say?
Egyptian Spanish.
Egyptian Spanish. Yeah, my brain is jet lagged. But yeah, it's mainly around the language issues and some of the examples that I think we've been getting most feedback so far. But we don't know how broad that's going to be.
But I think what unites us is, especially here at Skoll World Forum, is that we all believe in trying to cultivate as many social entrepreneurs, innovators, visionary leaders. And I think that the methodology to do that and how that gets applied to an educational system, an ecosystem, I think that unites us. I think at the end, how the language nuances will solve, we see Wikipedia, it works. There are local people who will get on if they buy into the learning theory and if they understand the value of the platform and how it adds value to the learning of the students at home, in community centers, in schools, in anywhere. If people really understand the learning theory, I feel that the language can be localized by the people who are using it. And actually, if you are really giving power and opening the systems as the Wikipedia experiment showed us, you see amazing things happening really, really fast because people really want to use it, people really want to publish in it. And so you see that the language thing can be solved. We have beautiful technologies these days to solve it.
So I can add a bit of nuance onto this language thing. We had talked about this. As we were looking into all the different range of software that could be integrated into these schools that we were helping to design, particularly around literacy, actually, this challenge came up, which was it wasn't just about that most of the products available right now have been developed in English and they'd need to be translated to Spanish. It's that the language ethic of particularly American English is quite efficient in the way that the communications happen, in the way that the software is designed. And actually, as our clients point out to us, is that in Peruvian culture, and particularly with the Spanish language, that things are more poetic and they're more fluid. And the way that narrative unfolds happens in a very different way. And so we actually kind of struggled with this, that the products are actually designed for efficiency when actually culturally that it went too fast. It kind of wasn't sticking very well. And so in the literacy software, we were lucky enough to have, there's a university in Peru that had been developing software. And so even if it hadn't yet been as fully fleshed out as some of the other things that were available that could be translated, it felt more locally resonant.
So you wanted to have the last word, and then we're going to open it up for questions.
Yeah, so just obviously a majority of our kids are second English language speakers, and our maths provider, well, we absolutely love them. There's absolutely no instruction, so it's all about intuition. So the kids are practicing, and eventually they get it that they need to add 1 + 2 boxes in order to get 3 boxes, whatever the case is. And even though we've had kids that are 8 years old, have spent 4 months in school, they now get it, and they're using this program brilliantly, and that they're advancing terrifically in maths, which we never thought would be possible. So that's a very, ST Maths, it's a very, very good example of how you can transfer it. And the animal is Gigi, which is a penguin, which a penguin's a penguin. It doesn't matter where you are, and I don't think it would offend anyone. So if anything, it's cute, and penguin. You ask the kids what's their favorite part of the day, and they say Gigi, and you're like, oh, there's more than that. So it's just, the kids can relate to it, and there's no instruction. It doesn't matter what language they're speaking. It's just all about intuition.
Terrific. Well, I have many more questions I could ask, but I know many of you have questions as well. So let's open it up for some questions from the audience, right here.
So a lot of these conversations in the education technology universe focus mostly on K-12 and higher ed. And so the question that I would like to ask, since this is called blended learning, there's 2 pieces of the education and learning puzzle that are very often excluded. And so I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on 2 things. One, parents, because mostly I hear you guys talking about parents in a very passive way, like they get to come to the school and celebrate instead of empowering the parents to be active, especially in the early childhood ages. And then early childhood. My perspective is that addressing middle school and high school, in some ways, if it's remediation that you were talking about, it's like addressing a stage 3 educational cancer tumor when we knew how to prevent it in the beginning by when 90% of brain development is happening in the first 5 years. So those 2 things.
Yeah. Can I talk about the parents? Sorry.
Yeah, either.
Yeah. So just in terms of parent involvement, we encourage 30 hours a year that parents can come in and get involved with their child's education, whether it's sitting in the classroom, watching the teacher teach, reading their child a book, whatever the case is, in the learning lab, seeing the kids on the computer, because we realize as a school we're not going to be there forever. So we need to empower the teacher and the child to take a responsibility for their lives. So it's about including them, constantly educating them, parent evenings, just always keeping in contact with them about anything. I mean, for example, one of our graders, our kindergarten, so 5-year-olds, started reading within 3 weeks. And I mean, it's all guided reading, but we videoed it and emailed it to the parent, and she was blown away. Schools in South Africa don't do that. They have a very closed door system. So we're really trying to open and educate our parents and the importance of education and following them throughout.
Yeah, and just to add to this, what's so beautiful about these technologies is that they're very transparent. So parents are actually able, for the first time, and their students too, and their kids too, to see every single day what their kids are producing. In our case, they really see anything from questions to research to doodling to illustrations to animation to coding. Now, I personally believe that game media and coding is the new literacy, that kids usually play it at home, but what schools in disadvantaged communities in particular can also teach the kids how to write. So not just how to read, how to play, but also how to write. And what we're trying to do in all of our systems is to communicate that to parents and to put them in workshops hands-on, to also try and write code and get an experience, because every kid that graduates from college these days with STEM or computing certificate degree knowledge has 2 or 3 jobs available. And I think the parents' education is so important, hands-on, to really understand that.
Okay, over here.
I liked what you said about how you measure your impact. My question is how much do your funders care? So you have your outputs, which are your videos, but I like that you're thinking beyond that to your outcomes, which is the global learning that's created. But does that matter to them?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think we are a strange entity in that in a lot of ways we're kind of a high-growth tech startup in the middle of Silicon Valley, but on the other side we're a not-for-profit, and we're primarily philanthropically supported. The lucky thing for us is that our philanthropists treat us like a good venture capitalist would. Obviously, they're not taking an equity stake in us. They're donating the money, but it usually is, here's X dollars, and we want you to continue, hopefully, to hit the ball out of the park. They don't necessarily say what hitting the ball out of the park necessarily means, and that's, we've discovered new ways. When we got our first funding from the Gates Foundation and Google, no one expected us to be formally used in schools. They just thought that it was really cool that there was this supplementary resource that was already being used by a few million people at the time, and maybe that could be interesting if it kept growing. But then all of a sudden, when it became used in Los Altos and now district-wide in Los Altos and in all over the world actually, that became an interesting dimension. And so we measure ourselves. There's a couple of things that we like to show off to our donors. One is just the aggregate traction that we're getting. Those are big numbers. And then on top of that, we want to show how we are catalyzing some of the changes that all of us are describing here. And then the other dimension is we like to highlight how we actually are or possibly maybe the best way to do ed research or cognitive research going forward, where we get, we run a 5% experiment in a day. We have 40,000 data points, 200,000 data points. And we started, we've been validating some of the growth-centered mindset stuff from Carol Dweck. We've been doing all these experiments that, traditional textbook manufacturers could never do. They could never A/B test. 5% of the population sees a different explanation. They never knew that version 5 was actually better than version 4. Yep. We can do all of those analytics. We can measure which tutorial is actually working, what's read and what's not read. So I think those are all of the things that, and the more we can do there, that I think gets our supporters excited.
Yeah, up here.
So I worked with OLPC in Cambodia. We had 200 of their computers and
Mike, please.
Hi. Yes. Okay. And we had 200 computers, and we had a fantastic teacher, and she got a lot of training, and they were making their own games, and yay, happiness. But there were so many other schools that we saw this technology just sitting there, right? So you have the distribution problem, you have the spare parts problem, but you also have the fact that most of this content was directed towards the kids, which you touched on. And how do we mass teach teachers how to incorporate this into their classroom? Is there anyone that's tackling teacher training of how to do this via the web? Is there a need for an academy of teaching teachers how to do this? Like, how do we make that bridge? If we get the technology there, where's that's the last mile problem here, I think.
Yeah, we have 5 interconnected platforms. One of them is dedicated to teacher training. And in this handout that I provided, there is some articles by teachers that actually talk about the training. It's somewhere in the room. You can pick up one. I think it's incredibly important to take the teachers through the experience of using Khan Academy for trying to figure out something, or using Global Laurea like a student. And that's what our academy do. Every teacher gets 4 days in the summer. They get assigned a mentor. The mentors are being very thoughtfully trained. The principal is trained for half a day, and the superintendent is trained for half a day. The teachers then come for 2 days in the next summer. And in between, they're on monthly webinars, and they have mentor and instructional help available to them at any time of the day. And I totally agree with you that you have to really build the ecosystem by taking the teachers into the same experiential methodology that the students are gaining from the blended learning. So blended training of teachers.
Sandy, can you address that from your looking at scalable models?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, I feel like with a lot of these questions, which are excellent, there aren't really answers or examples out there yet. There are a lot of experiments. There are a lot of traditional models that worked with the traditional model, and now we're kind of struggling to find new models that are about scale. One of the things that we designed, and again, this doesn't have evidence behind it. It's actually still in pilot phases and still kind of rolling out, so we're learning from it. Is in different systems, there are sort of different approaches to how we think about the creativity of teachers. There are certain systems, like if we look at KIPP in the US, where they sort of rely on the entrepreneurial enthusiasm and they do whatever it takes and they figure it out. And so the culture of those schools are, whatever you got to do it. Mm-hmm. And so that we see a lot of creativity, we see a lot of variance. there's a great network of schools called Bridge International Academies, which you might know. And one of the things that they're doing is they're actually sort of scripting the experience because it's right for the conditions of who they're serving and who they have as teachers. We went sort of in between that in the work that we've been doing with Innova, is looking at how do we actually sort of centrally create what we believe will be quality blended learning programs, but leave enough room that teachers can be flexible with it. They can find their own creativity in what's been structured. And that we built technology tools. There's actually something we call the Teacher Resource Center. So it's actually a knowledge sharing platform that will be used across their network of schools where teachers can share the adaptations they made. And so there's a way of sort of infusing a more regular dialogue as you're accessing those lesson plans to see what have other teachers done with those and then you can submit in what you've done with it as a way of kind of helping the system learn while it's been sort of structured for quality. I'll look forward to talking to you about it in a year or so.
Right here, and wait for the mic for the recording.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Eric Schwartz with Citizen Schools, and I'm a huge fan of Khan Academy, which we use in East Palo Alto and want to use in more places, and think it's an incredibly powerful tool, as I'm sure are the other ones represented here. I also have a fear, at least in a US context, that it could drive up learning, but also drive up the achievement gap, because it's such a powerful tool that I think high social capital communities are going to use it kind of faster and better, communities where my kids go to school, than some of the ones that we work in. And I just love your thoughts, Sal, and others about that challenge. Like, how can we get this tool, which is so powerful, to both drive up aggregate learning, but also drive it up faster among the disadvantaged in the US and other contexts?
Yeah, no, thanks for, I mean, yeah, you're right. And it's a double-edged sword, especially with us. You know, where we kind of inadvertently got started was Los Altos, which is one of the highest performing school districts. I can't afford to live in Los Altos. So one, you're like, oh wow, this is an affluent neighborhood, although it has had an interesting effect. The fact that the best school district in California, and probably one of the best in the country, if not the world, decided to do this blended learning shows that this isn't some type of a efficiency solution for the poor. It shows that it's a way to actually make the best. And when you do that, I mean, education is one of those fields that are, it's like fashion. It's incredibly aspirational. You know, people all want to wear the jeans that J-Lo was wearing. And it's the same thing here. Is this, if Los Altos does it, well, now all of a sudden you don't get the question of, hey, if this is so good, how come the kids on the other side of the railroad tracks aren't doing it? And so that's been a positive. You know, famously when Bill Gates started telling everyone that he uses it with his kids, I mean, that was a huge validation. He can afford tutors. And so I think that was very powerful. But with that said, I think you're right. Whether you call this an unfortunate or fortunate thing about it is, I think right now today, we have much higher penetration amongst educated families. If you go on the campus of Google or Facebook, or you go to Columbia or Harvard or Oxford, and you say, hey, are your kids using Khan Academy? 90% will say yes. You go to East Palo Alto or Oakland or a rural village someplace, what's Khan Academy? And so I think that's actually I think it's a good place to start from, because it validates it as not a solution for the poor. It's a hopefully a best-in-class solution that happens to be free. But I think, yeah, and I'd love to work with everyone in this room to figure out how we can get that distribution and that awareness to the people who need it most.
I want to make one more comment about this, because I think there's another dimension of it that we often don't think about. So if we just think about students using Khan Academy and MOOCs and all the other stuff out there to augment their classroom experience, I am almost certain that's skewed toward affluent, well-served students. But when you look around at blended learning models, a lot of them are actually targeting underserved communities. Sure. And I think that's good. It's a common phenomenon with disruptive innovation. It happens in part because the stakeholders are weaker, there's less resistance to change. It's like, okay, whatever.
The grants want you to go there. That's a big factor.
Exactly, there's funding to go there as well. So there is a lot of blended learning innovation going on in the US and in other countries in underserved communities. And I think that does not mitigate the other issue, but I think it's a positive.
But also the social entrepreneurship factor. My mission is to get that So I can increase girls' participation in computing, in coding, in computer science and engineering and innovation and design, and that I can increase minorities and low-income kids in that space. So I'm not just doing it just because of the grants, I really do this with a missionary zeal. So I'm targeting these areas, and I think that you don't have to worry about it. All these systems, as Salman was saying, all these systems are good for all these diverse populations. They really, really work well. We have tried them in all these diverse populations.
So we have to end the formal session on time because we're being recorded, and I am the moderator, so I get the last word. But then we are going to be here for another half hour, and we can continue to do some Q&A or devolve into individual lines if you prefer that. But before we do that, I just want to make a couple summary comments. First, I think it's very safe to say that disruptive innovation has been unleashed in education, and there's no turning back. We are entering a new phase. It's very exciting. There's all kinds of experimentation, and all of you are partly in a position to help determine where that goes and how fast that goes. I also think because of the nature of education and the students that we're reaching, we have an extraordinary opportunity to enlist the users, the learners, all around the world. Edith talked about this. Sandy talked about some of the challenges with this. Sal mentioned this as well. To enlist the learners as co-creators of the new future, co-creators of the solutions that don't yet exist. As Richard Jefferson proposed in this morning's plenary session, we can democratize the innovation process that's going on here, particularly because of the nature of the people who are involved in it. So I would also challenge all of you, when you're thinking about this area, to not just focus on what do we implement and how do we implement it, but how do we tackle that challenge and embrace this enormous opportunity to allow the kids who are the learners of today to create the learning environment of tomorrow. So thank you all. We are here for another half hour, but those who need to leave should feel free to do that.